Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much. I know folks are just beginning to hop on to tonight's webinar, Stopping Trade Attacks on Climate Policies, the Need for a Climate Peace Clause. My name is Ilana Solomon, and I'm with the Trade Justice Education Fund. Trade Justice is a nonprofit organization that sponsors public education programs designed to expand awareness about the worker rights, environmental and climate, and public health implications of US trade policy. And I'm super excited to be here with you all moderating tonight's event. So we actually have hundreds of people from across the United States that are joining us on this Wednesday evening to learn about and discuss how trade rules are impeding climate action, and what you can do and what we can do together to stop trade rules from impeding climate action. So as folks continue to join, I would actually love to ask everyone to please introduce yourselves in the chat box of Zoom, and invite you all to share in the chat box your name, the city and state where you're joining from. I'd love to hear just a few words about why you decided to join tonight's event and spend your evening with us discussing trade and climate. So please do introduce yourselves in the chat so we can get to know who is on the call tonight. As you are all introducing yourselves, thank you so much, Amy, for modeling for us. Look at this, folks from all over PA, Ohio. Love it. Thank you all. Keep introducing yourselves. As you do that, I just really want to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's event. Trade Justice Education Fund is so pleased to partner with the Sierra Club and to be joined by Hebah Kassem, and to be partnering with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and to be joined by Melanie Foley. And you will be hearing from both Melanie and Hebah very shortly. Again, for folks who joined, as I said, we have hundreds of folks joining from all across the US tonight. My name is Ilana Solomon. I'm with the Trade Justice Education Fund, and I will be moderating tonight's event. Seeing all these introductions across the US, I continue to be amazed and inspired by the amazing community of trade justice advocates. So just welcome everyone again, and we're so excited to have you all with us. And please do continue introducing yourself with your name, where you're calling from, and if you can, a few words about why you decided to join tonight's webinar. So with that, let's get started. Tonight's webinar comes at a really timely moment. Right now, 197 governments from across the globe are gathered in Egypt for a major international climate conference. Back in 2015, these governments adopted the Paris Climate Agreement, which, as many of you may know, is a legally binding international treaty that sets a goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the threshold beyond which we will likely see irreversible damages to economies and communities. And yet, unfortunately, tragically, the global community is not on track to meet these climate goals. And closing the gap between our current emissions reductions and the reductions needed to stay below or at 1.5 degrees of warming will require governments to dramatically ratchet up climate action to ensure that rapid transition of energy, industrial, and transport systems. It will require rich countries like the United States, those who did the most to create the climate crisis through unabated emissions, to act boldly, and to support developing countries who did the least to create the climate crisis and are bearing the greatest brunt of the impacts, to support those countries to transition to clean energy economies with the necessary finance and technology. And yet, trade and investment rules, which were written long before governments had committed to tackle climate change, as we will discuss tonight, are increasingly being used to directly challenge and otherwise discourage governments from climate and renewable energy policies. So we have a lot to unpack this evening, and we are going to unpack how we got to this situation in which trade rules are being used to threaten climate action. And we're going to discuss our proposal for a climate peace clause, which is a commitment that the United States and other governments can make right now to stop using rules in international trade agreements to challenge other countries' climate policies. We'll discuss how a climate peace clause can help set a new path forward and give countries the space that they need to put in place climate measures without the fear of costly trade cases getting in the way. So to help unpack these issues, we are going to hear first from Melanie Foley of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Melanie is going to help set the context for how and why trade rules are being used to threaten climate action, get into some specifics of examples and case studies, and discuss how, in broad strokes, a climate peace clause can help address this problem. And then after Melanie, we'll turn to Hebah Kassem from the Sierra Club to talk more about the urgency of aligning trade rules with climate action and more details of a climate peace clause and how it would work. Finally, after that, we're going to go to Q&A. So if you think of a question while our speakers are speaking, you don't need to wait until the end. We're going to use that Q&A function in Zoom where you can type your question at any time. So without further delay, thank you all again for joining, for introducing yourselves in the chat. I love seeing all these introductions come through, and let me turn it over to Melanie Foley.
Thanks, Ilana. I'm really excited to be here speaking with you all tonight. My name is Melanie Foley. I use she, her pronouns. I saw there are a lot of Marylanders in the chat coming to you from Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of DC. So I am with Public Citizen. We are a US consumer advocacy organization that champions the public interest in the halls of power. I am the deputy director of our Global Trade Watch division, which for more than 25 years has promoted government and corporate accountability in the globalization and trade arena. The global trade regime has long favored large multinational corporations at the expense of workers and the environment, because the corporations and their lobbyists have deep pockets and they can join the closed-door negotiations and influence trade deals. Moreover, trade rules themselves were written long before governments were contemplating how to tackle climate change. And several of the rules are fundamentally at odds with the types of actions that governments must take to address climate change and transition to clean energy economies. Every country should have the right to set its own clean energy future. And buy local rules are a standard policy tool to foster, nurture, and grow new industries. They can help us towards a clean energy future by cultivating domestic renewable energy firms that promote strong climate policies. And buy local policies can also benefit workers and bring in new constituencies to advocate for increased clean energy production. But according to outdated trade rules, these kinds of policies can be ruled as illegal subsidies for according less favorable treatment to the goods produced by other countries. If a policy is found illegal, that government may be forced to water down or eliminate the program, or else face onerous trade sanctions. And particularly in the early stages of countries' development, it is critical that governments have policy space to nurture and grow domestic industries. And that includes renewable energy industries. History shows that governments need a range of policy tools, including local content requirements, to cultivate and support such industries until they are internationally competitive. So, some examples from just the last decade. Ontario, Canada enacted a policy that paid wind and solar energy producers more money per kilowatt hour generated if a certain percentage of that producer's costs originated from Ontario. The program had successfully reduced climate disrupting emissions while creating thousands of green jobs. But the European Union and Japan took Canada to court at the World Trade Organization and won. 3 weeks later, Ontario eliminated its buy local provisions and ended incentives for large-scale clean energy projects. Another example, India implemented a federal solar local production program, and within 5 years went from having virtually no solar capacity to boasting one of the world's fastest growing solar industries. But the United States claimed that this policy violated WTO rules and won. India then retaliated and brought its own WTO dispute against the United States, successfully challenging several similar US renewable energy programs across 8 states. And today we are seeing trade partners, especially the European Union, threatening to launch a trade dispute against the United States over domestic production requirements in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, Sierra Club worked very hard on this bill, so I'll let Hebah share more on that. We don't know yet what will happen with the IRA, but in the other examples I mentioned, the main takeaway is that taxpayer dollars are going to the legal costs of fighting these trade disputes, and governments are being ordered to roll back their climate policies by international trade tribunals that prioritize adherence to corporate rigged rules over climate objectives. And as Ilana mentioned, to avoid the worst outcomes from climate change, humanity has less than a decade to make substantial progress toward eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. We quite literally do not have time to try to twist climate initiatives to comport with antiquated trade rules, nor to litigate such policies in dispute settlement claims. This is why we are calling for a climate peace clause, a binding commitment by governments to refrain from using trade and investment agreements to challenge other countries' climate policies. Now, importantly, this is not something that would be imposed on governments or a way for governments to declare for themselves a get out of jail free pass. It is a commitment to not launch disputes against the climate policies of other countries. So it sets an example and signals to other countries that they have the go-ahead to take the actions they need to. And if a dispute arises, it's not going to be coming from you. A government could unilaterally make such a commitment, do so in cooperation with one or more other governments, or write a climate peace clause into an existing or future trade agreement. So a climate peace clause, or rather many of them, would reverse the current paradigm by which climate is subordinate to trade. With a climate peace clause, measures that a country asserts, backed by basic evidence, aims to mitigate climate change and or support a clean energy transition will be protected from trade challenges. This would create the much needed space for governments to adopt and maintain the climate policies needed to create green jobs and meet their commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, this is not just a progressive pipe dream. The groups speaking here today recently joined more than 150 US environmental groups in calling for a climate peace clause. And a climate peace clause was also included in the UN's 5th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report. So the climate peace clause would help with the problem of governments attacking each other's climate policies. But we also have to deal with corporations attacking government policies through the investor state dispute settlement system, or ISDS. This is basically a special international legal system that lets multinational corporations sue governments and get taxpayer compensation over policies that affect their future expected profits. You all might have seen the John Oliver story a couple of years ago about Philip Morris, the tobacco company, suing Uruguay over its laws requiring health information on cigarette packaging. That was ISDS. And ISDS has been used repeatedly to attack climate policies. Or maybe you've heard about TC Energy, the Canadian company behind the Keystone XL pipeline. And this company is currently trying to use ISDS to get $15 billion from US taxpayers over the Biden administration's decision to revoke the permit for that pipeline. So if the United States, a country with immense political and economic power, cannot act on climate without facing trade attacks by both governments and corporations, how can we expect other countries to do so? So this is why it's so important for the US to help lead the way toward a total end to ISDS and a climate peace clause on governmental trade disputes. And I'll throw it back to you, Ilana.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie, for really shedding more light on this clash between the imperative to address climate change and how trade rules are getting in the way and why we need a climate peace clause. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to Hebah Kassem of the Sierra Club to take us deeper into these issues.
Thank you, Ilana, and thank you to Trade Justice Education Fund and Public Citizen for organizing this great discussion. I direct the Sierra Club's Living Economy program, where we focus on industrial transformation and trade at the intersection of climate, jobs, and justice. We are running out of time, and we must take bold action to address the climate crisis now. The US recently took some steps in that direction. Our team played a key role in helping pass the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or IRA, in Congress this year. It hasn't been an easy road, and the IRA is not perfect, but we are excited about the money coming from our federal government to help tackle the climate crisis. I'll start by giving some background on the IRA. After months and months of negotiations and efforts, in August of this year, the US signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which includes more than 100 programs that will invest nearly $370 billion in climate action, clean energy jobs, and environmental justice. The IRA includes billions of dollars to clean up heavy industry in the US, which is a priority issue area for us. The clean manufacturing investments will create hundreds of thousands of jobs over the next decade by helping establish and retool factories to manufacture electric cars, trucks, and buses, and wind turbines, solar panels, and other clean energy goods, while reducing toxic air and climate pollution from factories that produce cement, steel, and other highly polluting industrial products. One important piece of the IRA is increasing the manufacturing of electric vehicles. The IRA lowers the purchase cost of new qualifying battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles by up to $7,500 and used electric vehicles by up to $4,000. These tax credits lower costs for consumers and fleet owners and encourage the production and purchasing of electric vehicles, a crucial step in transforming our transportation sector. The Sierra Club fought long and hard for the IRA, and we are proud of this historic law that invests billions of dollars in reducing pollution and supporting healthier communities, and allows the US to take much needed steps to tackle the climate crisis. Unfortunately, before the IRA officially passed in Congress and became law, we saw some threatening challenges from other countries. In August, the European Union warned the US that the EV tax credit appears to violate global trade rules. The EU particularly was concerned with the domestic content and local assembly requirements for our electric vehicle tax credit. In a previous version of the bill, the EV tax credit was also criticized by ambassadors from the EU, Japan, Mexico, Canada, South Korea, and many European nations. It's unfortunate that as we were fighting for the single largest US investment ever in climate action, our partners and allies were attempting to undermine our progress by citing outdated trade rules written long before governments were taking climate change seriously. It's also unfortunate that the countries most forward-leaning on decarbonization are working at cross purposes. Conversations with scholars in Europe suggest that Europe is nervous that they will lose export competitiveness because of the US extension of EV tax credits to domestic manufacturers once the EU adopts a carbon border adjustment tax. Both German and Korean opposition to US EV tax credits hint at anxiety around these economies' dependence on exports at a time when global trade has been imperiled by conflict and geopolitical uncertainty. We also know that Europe needs more investment funding for its own industrial transition and that creative use of subsidies are being debated. The solution is not to do less, but more. And literally right now at COP27, there are conversations around climate and trade, including a carbon border adjustment mechanism. A carbon border adjustment mechanism is a priority for our team going into 2023, and we hope that the US will take steps to implement a carbon border adjustment tax. Now is not the time to challenge green jobs initiatives from countries taking the steps necessary to combat climate change. It's time to promote a climate-friendly trade model. And that's why we need a climate peace clause. A climate peace clause is a moratorium on the use of trade or investment rules in international agreements to challenge governments' climate policies. The current system is hostile to climate action. Trade cases within dispute settlement mechanisms continue to be used to challenge renewable energy policies across the world, policies that we desperately need to reduce emissions and ramp up renewable energy production. To protect climate action from outdated trade rules, we support incorporating a climate peace clause into new and existing trade and investment agreements and frameworks. It would help protect any measure a country takes to implement its climate commitments. These measures could include, for example, policies to reduce use of and reliance on fossil fuels, such as rejecting fossil fuel permits, bans on fossil fuel extraction, and removal of fossil fuel subsidies, or policies to ramp up the production and distribution of renewable energy and clean energy goods, like electric vehicles, heat pumps, and wind turbines, and such as subsidies, procurement policies, and domestic content preferences. Such a clause would give countries the policy space to enact the climate policies needed to meet or exceed their commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement. A climate peace clause would also give us more time to permanently remove the threats that outdated trade rules pose to the climate action our communities urgently need around the world. It would allow countries to take necessary bold climate action without fear of unnecessary challenges from trade agreements. It would help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions and toxic pollution worldwide, allowing for a safer and healthier planet that we all need. A climate peace clause would also prevent the US from taking advantage of outdated rules to shut down other countries' policies, like we've seen in India and its solar policies that Melanie had just mentioned. We'd expect and push richer countries like the US to sign up first for a climate peace clause, and it could be a potential tool to help countries create and maintain high-paying jobs with strong labor standards, and not just in the US.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hebah and Melanie, for giving us so much great information and fodder for discussion. I've already seen a lot of questions come through, and as a reminder to folks that may have joined later, we are using the Q&A function for questions, so please feel free to type in any questions you have, and we will be turning to that shortly. I know we put out a lot of information to everyone, so I'm going to attempt to summarize a few key points in the climate peace clause, and then we will go into the most important part of the evening, which is right before the Q&A, which is the take action part. But let me just do a few summary pieces to make sure we're still all on the same page together. I don't think I need to give more context or reminder. Our panelists did it so well on why we need a climate peace clause in the context of the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for governments to be putting in place policies to address that crisis without the fear of trade cases getting in the way. So again, a climate peace clause is a really actually very simple, easy step that a government can take right now without Congress. We can talk more about that later. That is just saying, just because the rules exist doesn't mean we actually have to use them. So a climate peace clause is just a commitment from governments to refrain from using dispute settlement mechanisms in trade agreements to challenge countries' climate or clean energy measures. When we were thinking about, and we have a paper coming out shortly that will describe more details about the climate peace clause, why it's needed and how it could be structured. We were thinking a lot about what is a climate policy essentially? And we wanted to make sure that's really broad and essentially say that, a climate peace clause would apply to any measure really that a country claims with some factual basis as an objective of mitigating climate change or transitioning to a clean energy economy. So that sort of factual basis could be discerned from the architecture of a policy, the structure, the context in which the measure was adopted. Was it part of the IRA, like those electric vehicle? Was it part of a climate policy, like those electric vehicle tax credits that Hebah spoke about? And really importantly, a country would not need to demonstrate the degree to which a climate measure mitigates our emissions or whether a less trade restrictive measure exists. That's not the point here. That's the old trade model where trade trumps climate, and we want to bring us into the new trade model where climate is the key imperative and trade must support that. One other thing that I would flag that we haven't discussed is we have proposed that a climate peace clause could have a fixed term, and we suggest a term of 10 years renewing automatically. And that will allow countries the time and space needed to put in place bold climate policies. So it provides that certainty, but it also gives countries a big period of time, 10 years, to come together to fix the rules. Because we don't just want governments to have to refrain from using the trade rules. We actually want to fix the structural problems of the rules, and a 10-year period would give that time out for governments to come together to fix the rules. That's just a little bit more context and to reiterate a few pieces. There's one question that's in the Q&A. I'm going to speak to that in just a moment before going to the take actions, which is why now? Why a peace clause now? And the answer is not just that we're running out of time, for governments to put in place policies to address the climate crisis before we have catastrophic, irreversible damage, although that is true, but it's also because this is the right political moment. Sadly, the Obama administration was preoccupied with passing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Climate change didn't even appear in any of the trade agreements under the Obama administration. Trump, of course, thought climate change was a hoax. He would never and will never be an ally on a climate peace clause. But the Biden administration, with pressure from all of you, really could be a champion for this. We have a US trade representative who is committed, who said she is committed to building a worker-friendly, a climate-friendly model of trade, but they're still defining what that looks like. So this is really our moment to get this done and our job to engage the US administration to make this a reality. So before we go to Q&A quickly, let me just reiterate some of the key ways that you all could join with us to make the Climate Peace Clause a reality. Another reason tonight is so timely is because, as we discussed, we are eager to see the Climate Peace Clause in multiple forums. A government, the US government, could just commit and say, climate crisis is too important. We commit to a climate peace clause. We commit to not challenge other countries' climate policies. But ideally, you would have it done in settings of multiple countries, coalitions of the willing, in trade and investment agreements. Well, luckily for us, in just a few weeks, on December 5th in Washington, D.C., we are going to have negotiations between the US and the European Union on an agreement called the TTC, or the Trade and Technology Council negotiations. And this is a great space for a trade agreement between the US and the EU to insert language calling for a climate peace clause. So we have a take action for you all tonight to write to the US trade representative, the highest decision maker on trade in the US government. Arthur, my colleague from Trade Justice, is sharing the link in the chat. And we really ask you to please take a moment and just sign that petition calling for a peace clause in the TTC negotiations and beyond. If you are interested in doing more than signing a petition, which is already a great first step, I also just want to note that our organizations have staff who are ready to give a short presentation on trade and climate and the need for a climate peace clause at your local group meeting. We really need to have more people understand this proposal for a climate peace clause and then advocating for it with, for example, the US government and US trade representative like you all, I hope will take action with us tonight. If you would like a presentation on the climate peace clause at your upcoming group meeting, Arthur has also just put in the chat an email address, climate@tradejusticeedfund.org. And if you just shoot us a quick email, we will, between our organizations, make sure that everyone who is interested in having a presentation at their upcoming meeting has the opportunity to have that presentation. So with that, please take action. Sign the petition. If you're interested in learning more, let us know, and we will happily join your group meeting to talk more about trade, climate, and a peace clause. And for now, we are going, wow, so many questions have come in, so we probably won't be able to get to all of these tonight, but I'm going to start with one, scrolling, that says, is there a precedent for a climate peace clause? Or I'm sorry, is there a precedent for a peace clause on any other issues, or is this a brand new idea? And Melanie, I'm going to throw this one over to you.
Sure, thanks. So there is precedent. Peace clause is, not a new idea. The World Trade Organization has an agreement on agriculture that included a provision that's commonly known as a peace clause, which provided for a trade ceasefire against countries' domestic agriculture support and other policies. It was written to expire at the end of 2003. So then in 2013, at the WTO Bali Ministerial, the WTO was pressured in the face of a deadlock, during the negotiations on public food stock holding and other matters, countries agreed to enact a new Agricultural Peace Clause, which is designed to protect food security measures in developing countries, though many stakeholders in the Global South are still working to strengthen the terms of that 2013 Peace Clause. So in short, there is precedent and we can get this done.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie. We have a question from an old friend, hello Selden, who asks to talk a little bit more about the link between the peace clause and investor-state dispute settlement. Hebah or Melanie, would you like to take that one?
I could as well. So a climate peace clause would mainly address government-to-government attacks on climate policies, what we call state-to-state dispute settlement. Additionally, we're encouraging countries to fully exit the ISDS regime. And so these are two things that can be happening simultaneously. They could be part of the same agreement, but don't have to be.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, and just to, emphasize that point, I think these are two complementary movements happening. One is to eliminate the state-to-state threats, these government threats, the other to eliminate the possibility of corporations using these private trade tribunals. And governments in the climate peace clause can also make their commitment and say, because the climate threats are so great, we will exit our existing investor-state treaties. We will not sign any new treaties with investor-state dispute settlement, so the two can come together in that way. Okay, but we touched on this briefly, but there is a question about, would the climate peace clause have to be approved by Congress, and would that make it impossible to pass in the short term? What would you say to that?
Yeah, great question. No, we don't need Congress to pass a climate peace clause. It doesn't change US law. It's merely a commitment to not enforce the trade rules that exist. And so it could be done through the US Trade Representative, USTR. But that said, we can get Congress to weigh in, and they can play a very important role and urge USTR to commit to a climate peace clause. And one action that you all can take is calling your senator and your representative, telling them that you're deeply concerned about the threats of trade policy to climate action, and that you're asking them to urge USTR to commit to a climate peace clause.
Great. One of the things I love about this idea most is governments can do it right now. And would benefit from encouragement from members of Congress, but it is not required to pass. So thank you, Hebah, for highlighting that. Greg, I love that you are looking for more ways to take action. Greg has asked whether it is more effective to email the US Trade Rep directly, and he included an engagement at ustr.eop.gov than to sign yet another petition. And I really appreciate that question, because there are a lot of petitions that fly around. And my response is, it's not either or. We will collect the petitions and we will deliver it to the USTR. We will make sure they see it. We will try to hand it to them directly at the US-EU negotiations on December 5th. But that should not stop you. And thank you for looking up and seeing on the USTR webpage another email address. And you should write that one too. And you should, as Hebah said, call your representative and your senator and ask them to call the USTR as well. So I would just say, we really do deliver these petitions. They really do matter. And if there are other ways that you see to engage, we strongly encourage that as well. This is a new idea. The Biden administration is calling for ideas like this out of the box, haven't been done. So as many ways as we can get to them, and as many people as you can tell to reach out to the administration, the better. Okay, apologies as I scroll through many of these questions. We talked about this one a little bit, but another question is ending investor-state dispute settlement realistic? And I'm curious if either of you would like to take that one.
I can. Yes, absolutely. And, Ilana was talking about how timely this conversation is. And this is another example of that. We're seeing just this week and in the days before, a whole string of European countries have exited the Energy Charter Treaty, which is basically an agreement that's designed to make it easier for energy companies to use ISDS. And so we've seen, I think the latest one was Germany, a whole string of countries have left. We also just saw, I think yesterday, Australia announced that it will not enter any new pacts with ISDS. The Biden administration has said the same thing. So there's tons of momentum here. That said, there are still over 2,000 existing agreements with ISDS that we need to address. And so we just need to stay on it.
Awesome. Thank you, Melanie. Trying to keep up here with all the amazing questions. I see some people are adding them into the chat function. One I see from Rich is why the peace clause does not need congressional approval, why the Trans-Pacific Partnership did. I'm gonna try just a very broad answer to this, which is that, again, one of the great things with the climate peace clause is that it's not a new piece of legislation. It's not amending existing legislation. It's not a new trade agreement, which needs to be approved by Congress. It's simply a commitment to not enforce rules that already exist, and that does not need congressional approval. Again, we would like our members of Congress and our champions to support and to encourage USTR, but because it's not a new law, it is agreeing to not enforce something that already exists. It does not need congressional approval. Let's see. Great question from Karen. Is the climate peace clause an international push or just in the US? How do we encourage other countries to abide? Melanie, you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure. So, as a US-based organization, Public Citizen, we feel it's our primary responsibility to push the US, which is also a huge emitter of global of greenhouse gases. So it's our responsibility to really push the US government to take the lead on this. I think other wealthy governments should join as well. So it is an international push where I think we're envisioning kind of a patchwork of climate peace clauses that could eventually cover the whole world. But it really should start with the rich countries who kind of created the climate crisis to begin with and are most responsible for addressing it. And we would, want to make sure that any climate peace clause, is combined with technology transfer and financing for climate mitigation for developing countries.
Great, thank you, Melanie. Yeah. Another great question we spoke a little bit about this, but it's a little more on the question of why is now? Why now? Why is this the time to enact a climate peace clause? I'm going to throw that over to Hebah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I said, we are running out of time, and Melanie also outlined that we literally do not have time to wait. We need countries, especially the bigger countries that are responsible for the climate crisis, to take action now and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and toxic pollution around the world, and should not be challenging each other. We just don't have time for that. They can challenge each other on other things, but not on the climate, because we are all impacted by that. And we need bold action now worldwide.
Well, it is 8:40 p.m. Eastern, and I think that is an incredible note to end on. All of your questions and engagement is incredible. Your introduction, seeing people from across the country engaging on this new idea at this timely moment, both when we have 197 governments in Egypt crafting the next step of our international climate architecture, and when we're 2 weeks away from negotiations between the US and the EU on what's called the TTC agreement, where we need to push the US Trade Representative to add a climate peace clause to that agreement. Thank you, Arthur, once again for reminding everyone, and the link is in the chat to sign the petition. We will deliver it. Your name will be shared. We will do a press release around it. We will make sure the US Trade Representative sees our names. and your names on this. And again, thank you everyone for joining tonight, and we will be sharing more information on this new and emerging exciting idea in the near future. Thank you all, and we look forward to staying in touch. You know how to reach us. And thank you to our amazing panelists, Melanie and Hebah as well.
Thanks, Ilana. Thanks so much, everyone.
Good night.
Everyone.